The competitive 40K network presents Art of War.
Art of War.
Strategy and tactics. Discussions with the best players on the planet. Now your host, Nick Nanavati.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Art of War 40K podcast. I'm your host, Nick Nanavati, and this week we are joined by a very special guest, a member of the GW stream team and an honorary member of Team Art of War, Tucker Rickey. Tucker, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Nick. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. Tucker, you're on the back of a first place victory with Genestealer Cult, one of my favorite factions, at a local event here to us in Orlando, the Layton Gaming event by Away Games. And you did not have an easy run. I mean, you went through Jack Harpster, other members of the team were there. This was a Shark Tank of a small tournament, and you managed to go straight up undefeated with GSC. How's that feel?
It feels great. It was definitely one of the hardest events I've participated in. So that was pretty cool.
That's crazy. It goes to show you size isn't the only thing that matters. But how many players were actually at this tournament?
I believe there were 47 signed up for the first day.
Yeah, so solid GT nonetheless. Definitely nothing to shake a stick sideways at. And we're here basically to kind of get to know you, Tucker, your army list that you took, the Genestealer Cult, an army we have not talked about in months. And they're on the rise lately. They're an uprising, perhaps. So we're going to break it down, list, tactics, strategy, everything. And then in part two for our patrons, we're going to talk about how it all happened on the table, game by game by game by game, including a nail-biter round against our very own Jack Harpster. So if you want to subscribe to that, folks, you can on patreon.com/AOW40K. We are closing in on episode number 300. That is a legacy. It's almost 5 years long. We can't do it without your support, and it means the world to us. So if you want part two to this episode, along with a Discord server where you can talk to all these different players, including Tucker, check out patreon.com/AOW40K. All right, Tucker, that's enough spieling and dealing. Let's get into the good stuff. Tell me about yourself. How did you get into Warhammer?
I got into Warhammer a little over 5 years ago, right before COVID had started. And I used to play card games with some buddies back in Jacksonville. And one day we went up to the game store, and a fellow named Zach Rockner was working there. And he influenced me into buying a World Leaders Combat Patrol. That was when I fell in love with it pretty much immediately. I built the models. I bought all these pre-owned models just to get to the 2,000 points so I could start going to events and playing as many games as possible. And I've been in deep since then.
Wow. So you actually haven't been playing that long in the grand scheme of things. And some of these guys that we get on the podcast have been playing since they were like a kid. How did you get into it?
I got into it by showing up to the game stores, and I would sit around for a couple hours and wait for somebody to walk in to play a game with for a while.
Dude, that's the life. People don't know about that. That's how it's done.
That's how it used to be, man. When the Discords or Facebook groups, it was hanging out and waiting for people to play pickup games with. So did that for a while, and then towards the later end of 8th edition, I kind of got into the more competitive side of things about when Engine War came out, and that's when I started attending events and really got into playing the game.
That's spectacular. So there is a lot to be said about that. I mean, for starters, your journey overall, you're going from 5 years ago, going to a game store and waiting around to now winning GTs with like world-class players at them, working for GW. Tell me a little bit about that story. How did you even get here?
So I was playing games with Zach, who's a good friend of mine, and he went to work at GW. And so when I was able to, I asked him if he had any open positions on their events team. And I got on building models originally for all of the pay intakes and stuff like that. And then I started going to the events with them, and I'd help with setup and breakdown. And then when we got back into streaming events, when I got to that level, they asked if I was able to help with that. And I've been doing the maps at the events. So that's been a lot of fun.
That's spectacular, dude. And what an awesome way to interact with the hobby, like working on the maps. And I know you're part of the stream team as well. Like, I appreciate the service you bring to the hobby overall, just sharing the hobby with so many people from, Twitch and whatever. That's amazing. Tell me about your competitive side. You and I played a while back at ATC a few years ago. And, back then you were solid, but you were not, where you are today in terms of generalship. So how have you gotten better at the game, and what was your path for that?
No, so I actually went to that event and I got beat up by you round one, and I was like, man, that was not the most fun experience. We had a great game. It was a lot of fun to play the game, but I was like, man, I need to get into it, get some win in some games. So my buddy Quentin, who you guys worked very closely with for a
Oh
while,
yeah. Q
he
money.
was Q Money, Quentin. Rampage. He was very into the competitive side of things, so I asked to play a couple of games with him. And I remember when I started playing games with Quentin, the Eldar Codex in Ninth Edition had just come out, and that was a thing and a half. And I kind of just slammed my head into it a bunch of times, and I was like, "This is a lot of fun to try and get into this game competitively." And then from there, I tried to find as many games with good players as I could, and it went from there.
That's amazing. So you weren't actually too deep into the competitive scene when I met you and we played that game. That was like one of your first exposures to it.
That was I'd been playing at tournaments for a while, but I hadn't been playing as well at
Sure.
that point. So yes, and that was kind of one of the very first real tournaments that I went to.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay, so that was new information for me. I'm very excited to learn that fun fact about you. Now, talk to me about your getting better journey, because obviously you've come a long way since you and I played many moons ago, and you play against people who are better than you, which is great, like generic advice. But what did that mean for you on the table? What were you looking for in terms of improvement in your game, and how did you identify it and then actually improve?
The easiest step forward was going from losing games big to losing games small to winning games small was kind of the steps that I was taking. So I wouldn't always, as soon as a game was lost, kind of give up. I think that's where I was earlier on in my competitive journey. But when I really started to see some change was when I would play games out all the way until the end, and I'd try and keep them as close as possible. And that kind of gave me the idea of how to keep games close in the first place and then how to win them from there. So that's been my and then sticking to one army has also been very, very helpful. So I used to kind of jump around between like World Eaters and AdMech and Tau every once in a while. And then I started playing GSC beginning of ninth edition, and I've pretty much exclusively played them since then. So getting to know how one army works very, very well has been my best step forward.
That's amazing. Okay. So I love that approach. You know, we have lots of people on the podcast all the time talking about how they get better at Warhammer. And I don't think anyone I've ever talked to has described it as you start just kind of sucking, right? And then
Yep.
you get better by losing smaller, and then that teaches you like how to play Warhammer basically, and then go from there to winning. And you also had mentioned how you finished games all the way to the end, you know, played them through and stuff. When you were doing all this, what type of mistakes were you identifying and then correcting for yourself to try to get better?
There would be a lot of small things like not measuring threat ranges, stuff like that, checking that before the end of my movement phase, you know, just staying outside of that 24.1 inches or whatever it was, leaving some models in cover to get some better saves. Just very small things that leaving enough OC on objectives to hold points if somebody came to try and contest them. Setting up plays for the future was another really big one that when I used to just kind of play the game turn by turn by turn.
Mhm.
And then when staging and stuff like that was really the big leap forward, I would say. Just learning to play and plan for all 5 turns of the game rather than the very next one that you're going to take.
This is some really great advice and kind of hard for a lot of players, I think, who are not that good at Warhammer, but looking to get better to really wrap their head around. What did you focus on, I guess, like more specifically, if you can, in terms of seeing the game 5 turns ahead or 4 turns ahead, 3 turns ahead, instead of just the turn you're in? I think that's something that a lot of players start out with because they can only see as far as they can see. But then it's a necessary skill to see further. How do you do that?
One thing that I would be really, really bad about is I would, someone would throw a big scary unit at me and I would respond with like the entirety of my army, not thinking about the fact that they had more staged behind that. And so
Right.
when I do that, you show the entire army, you do kill whatever you're most worried about or take care of. And then the second wave of their army hits you and all of a sudden you don't have anything left. So you've overcommitted to a degree. So learning how to commit just enough at the right time has been the most helpful.
I think that's actually great advice. Just seeing where all their stuff is staged and all that, and someone puts a unit at the common advice, very very normal wisdom that people try to follow is basically trying to make sure you overkill the target. You don't want to leave stragglers alive to then function as if they hadn't done any damage, but they can overcommit and then they get destroyed. So like pacing that out a lot more, seeing the game through more turns is pretty crucial to success there. Now, you play GSC to kind of bring it back into the present a little. GSC is one of the more complicated armies in the game, and they definitely reward you for being able to see many turns into the future. Have you always played GSC, or have you got into it recently?
Oh, GSC has been my army for, I'd say, probably as long as I've been taking 40K competitive seriously. I finished out my collection recently within the past year, so I have everything in triplicate. I kind of got rid of most of my other stuff, but for the past probably 3 or so years, it's pretty much been GSC on GSC.
Wow. I mean, as a forearm follower, I love that and I respect it. Do way to stick with the hustle. This is an army that often doesn't get a lot of love from GW. We've had one new model release the entire edition, one codex, and that's about it. Our model range is kind of limited in general, and our rules are very esoteric, and our player base is pretty narrow. There's not many people playing GSC. So, what drew you to this faction? How do you find playing it kind of in this world where it's very unknown?
What I really enjoy about GSC is there's almost a level of certainty to it, not necessarily in damage, but I never have to worry about whether or not this unit's going to die. I kind of know that it is going to die, but that's part of the game plan. Like I don't have to worry about I need to roll well on my saves. I'm like, nope, these 5 acolytes are going to go over there. They're going to die, but they've done the thing that they're supposed to do, right?
Right.
And then move blocking as well. You don't really usually have to roll a ton of dice to move block, so that sort of certainty has been very helpful with GSC. And then just a bunch of bodies. I love putting a bunch of dudes on the table.
As you should.
Yes, exactly.
I think that what you just said hits the nail on the head, right? There's a lot of certainty with Genestealer Cult. You don't have to really roll advances or charges. You deep strike your models into place, and durability is not really a factor. You don't care how hard your opponent hits. You rolling a hit and rolling a wound is more of a formality. You will do the damage to your opponent and then kind of move on from there. So what did you like? Learning GSC is a very unique proposition. It's a very unique approach to learning Warhammer. How did you find just basic learning of the game?
It was so wildly different from the previous armies that I had played that I was kind of just immediately interested in it. It was just kind of like this plays so differently from everything that I'm used to that I really want to learn how to use this, how to get good at this, because I think that it's a very interesting army.
Dude, I love that. And it's a type of army that really rewards a faction expert, and I love to see that you're putting in all the reps and the time to really master it. So tell me, Tucker, in this ever-shifting landscape of a meta with the new balance status, slate challenger cards, and knights coming on the rise, along with these cult books, do you think GSC is strong, weak, in the middle? If you have the pilot for it, where do you think they are in terms of a tier list, if you would?
I would put them in a solid A. If you are dedicated and you're willing to play them and put the reps in with them, I think that with the meta that we're in currently, and that was kind of my thought process with this event, was because of all the knights and stuff that have come out. GSC have a very good game into really both forms of Imperial and Chaos Knights, which is very important in the meta right now. And I think also a lot of people are teching into killing knights, which means if you show up to a table with 100, 120 bodies, they might not necessarily have the things in their list to deal with that because they're worried about one big toughness 11 body.
Yeah, makes sense. It's a very different approach to Warhammer that you're taking here, and I think you're actually spot on that it's a very well positioned in the metagame right now. So kudos to you for kind of being rewarded for sticking to it this whole time. Tell me about your list. What was the actual list you took to this Layton tournament?
So the actual list that I took was one Acolyte Iconward with a Prowling Agitant. It was a 15-point enhancement, just had some points left over. 2 Benefictuses. One of them had Assassination Edict for the +1 to hit. A single Kelermorph. A Primus with the Chink in their armor, which is just a staple in every Hosts of Ascension list. 3 Reductus Saboteurs to round out the characters. I love those little guys. 1 squad of Acolytes with Autopistols. They do the sit on my home field and grab me command points every once in a while. 3 squads of Acolytes with Hand Flamers. 80 Neophytes, top to bottom, 420-man squads. 3 Ridge Runners, 2 with Spotters, and 1 with the Survey. And then all of them have Mortars, just to buff AP the whole game. 1 squad of Atlan Jackals, because that unit moves very, very fast. If you go first, can screen really well. 1 squad of Hybrid Metamorphs, and then 2 5-man squads of Pure Strange Genestealers, just to have some infiltrate to start up the board a little bit.
Nice. Very small, very compact, very lots of 200 bodies. Tell me about the overall strategy here for how it actually functions on the table.
So my favorite unit, which I hadn't seen very much in other GSC lists, was the 20-man Neophyte unit with an Iconward. I think you see a lot of them with Benefictuses and Primuses because those units give a very nice damage increase. But the 5-up Feel No Pain on that unit is one of my favorite things as of recently, because a lot of the scariest parts of playing Hosts of Ascension is getting ran down very quickly, because most of your armies in Deep Strike, you don't really have a turn 1 Deep Strike tool like a lot of other Deep Strike armies do. So you got to kind of wait until turn 2 to bring most of your damage in. And having just 20 bodies with a 5-up Feel No Pain that can regrow a bunch of guys starting on the board is a very nice primary tool for turns 1 and 2. And then that kind of works in partnership with all of the little skirmish units like the Metamorphs, the Atlan Jackals, the 5-man Pure Strain squads to screen and set up screens so that the majority of my damage can kind of come behind them and drop in, shoot whatever they need to. So that was the primary plans for turns 1 and 2, was sending the 20 men out, usually into the center objective, just because it would require my opponent to commit a lot more than they wanted to kill the little Neophyte brick. And then most of the time, what I would do is, if they poke out enough of their army that I'm worried about the unit actually dying, after the first activation, they would use the Return to the Shadow stratagem to jump away right afterwards. So my opponent's army would be exposed, that I could Deep Strike and shoot into them, and my unit would still be safe, so it could come down on like their expansion and just harass them and be an annoying block to deal with. So that was kind of the early game plan, that and screening with Jackals and Genestealers and the Metamorphs and whatnot. The Reductuses were amazing the entire event. I don't think I'll ever leave home with less than 3 Reductuses. Those little models are, every time somebody asks how many mortals those guys do, I get a big grin on my face, because it's a lot is basically the answer. And then in Hosts, they're very good because they can set off that D3+3 when you walk near them. And then when your opponent goes to charge them, you can pay a CP to do D3 more mortal wounds to them, which a lot of skirmish units really don't like, taking a bunch of mortals on the way in. And some just flat out die to it. If you get a little high roll on the mine, and then you get the 3 mortals or just even 2 mortals, you're doing 8 to 9 mortal wounds to something trying to charge a 65-point unit. So those guys are amazing. And then from there, it was just kind of responding. It was a very responsive game plan. As soon as my opponent would poke out, I'd have the 40 or 60 models up in Deep Strike to come down, deal with them. Most of the time, it was Deep Striking in my own turn. One of the only real rapid ingress damage units that I do was sometimes the Primus Neophyte squad would come down, because their Overwatch is very, very good. Because they still get the sustained lethals, ignores cover with 4 rules to hit in Overwatch as well. So if you've got those 2 command points banked in your turn and your opponent sets up a charge into something on your objective, you can drop in, Overwatch the unit on its way in, and then they can walk over and shoot at something else, which was a very helpful thing to have. And then the Hand Flamers are just running around being annoying, costing 2 ambush points to respawn.
Yeah, I see it. It all comes together very nicely, and I love the tech you went into with the Iconward Neophytes. I have never ran that unit myself. That is absolutely unique tech to you, Tucker. I don't know if I've ever seen that before. That's really clever. So walk me through kind of the damage. I know GSC has a way of making trash guns hurt very badly. Tell me about how hard these Neophyte bricks when they come down.
Oh man, those Neophyte bricks. Those guys are punching so far above their weight class. It's just not even funny. You have access to effectively every positive buff in the entire game. You've got your full rerolls to hit. You've got sustained lethals. You can crit on 5s. If you really need it, you can give the whole unit +1 to wound. So the unit with the Primus was definitely the mainstay for damage. Whenever there was something really, really big coming towards me, or if there were 3 or 4 units that had to be dropped in, shot, and killed, those were the guys to go do it. The Benefictus squads were nice to start on the board, just because they have lethal hits all the time. So, because that is one thing that has been problematic for GSC recently, I think, is just if your opponent knows what they're doing into them, they just kind of run in a straight line at you, especially if they go first, because then they effectively get 2 turns before you're allowed to deep strike anything.
Right. Because you have so much off the board, so they just get to play 2,000 points versus 1,000 points for a little while.
Exactly. And if they're a good player and they know what they're doing against that, they can get really far forward. They can understand that you don't have a ton of damage on the board, so they can just run and get screens up in the early game, which you try to stop by move blocking, but sometimes you play against fly armies, or sometimes they drop first with infiltrators, so it can get a little difficult. So sometimes in games where I was worried about getting ran down, 1 to 2 of the Benefictus squads would start on the board, because they can just always pop out and have lethal 5s with 1,000,000 shots. Or if it's a really big target, both squads can pop out and get +1 to wound against it, like a knight was one of the big ones. And then the Reductuses were very helpful to deal with screens that were running in. And then I also brought a Kelermorph to help with that. So the idea was, if someone tries to throw like a big 5-man somewhere, run it up the board to screen something out, the Reductus can set off her mine, and then there'd be either an Overwatch or the Kelermorph reactive shooting to kind of deal with those screens.
Right. Okay, so you have like this crazy damage basically from stacking Ridge Runners, which will give you an extra point of AP. The Primus has access to reroll hits for whatever he's unit joined to. Your detachment rule is ignores cover and sustained hits when you deep strike. And then the Benefictus joined to a unit gives you lethal hits. So all said and done, these units are like 20 dudes that hit like ludicrously hard and kind of show up out of nowhere and deep strike upon you and get blasting. Now, the hard part to this, aside from your opponent just blitzing straight at you, which I'm going to ask about in a bit, is like your army is made of dudes. Like these are guardsmen-like models, T3, 1 wound, 5-up armor, everywhere, and you have resurgence points to try to come back to life, but like actually no durability. How do you manage such a glass cannon type of force?
The no durability is definitely one of the hardest parts to kind of get used to with Genestealer cults. The big 20-man units really do just kind of waste away to a 5-man squad of warp spiders or something like that. So a lot of the primary game plan is using move blocks and putting lone ops behind your move blocks to score your primary. And then the biggest and by far most helpful tool for keeping my damaging units alive is the Return to the Shadows stratagem, because as much as they are just, toughness 3 with a 5-up save and 1 wound apiece, a lot of armies don't have units that can, in a single activation in shooting, wipe the entire squad. So often you get shot by one thing and then you can spend a command point to jump that unit away. They get dudes back over the course of the game and then kind of come back and do damage elsewhere, or just be alive at the very least. So keeping units alive with Return to the Shadows was the number one help. And then the other option was just putting all 80 dudes in front of my opponent in a turn, killing all of their horde clearing things with the damage that I do have, and then standing on primary points with 20 guys and leaving them with stuff like Havocs or Atroposes or stuff like that don't get too many attacks. Right. Was the way to deal with it.
Makes a lot of sense. Sounds like you gotta get durability through distance control and like your opponent's not being able to full activate and kill 20 guys and then going up in reserve. Talk to me a little bit about how you handled getting into close combat. There's no fallback and shoot, no fallback and charge. Your army is actually anemic at damage in close combat, as far as I can tell. How do you handle that phase?
Getting tagged is definitely the hardest part about playing Genestealer cults, because like you said, as soon as you're in combat with a rhino, that unit is where it is for the rest of the game and there is nothing you can do about it. So One of the helpful things to do that I've found is spreading out the units and connecting them with a line. And it's kind of complicated, but putting a T almost in front of your units with their own models. And then if your opponent goes to charge those units, when they kill models, you pull the guys that are completing the line out of coherency from the other guys.
Right.
And then your opponent can't consolidate into you. Those models die to coherency, and then you're not in combat going into your turn.
Let me make sure I can wrap my head around this, because I think this is like a key component to playing GSC at the high levels. So, like, if your unit is in coherency, every model is within 2 inches of at least two other models, because it's a large unit. And then at various points in your unit, or like one specific point in your unit, a T-cross, for example, you're going to pull the casualties from there, so that then your unit is no longer in coherency, but you just have these strands of neophytes that are in a unit but not in coherency. And then even if your opponent then, after killing some guys, consolidates into you at the end of the turn, since you're out of coherency, you'll just pull however models you need to get back into coherency, but in doing so, you pull yourself out of close combat. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's the idea.
Awesome. I think that's such a cool trick. How do you set that up effectively? I mean, I know you mentioned the T formation, but is there any more to it, or is this something that's difficult to do, easy to do?
It can be, depending on the terrain layouts and where your opponents allowed you to deep strike, it can be fairly difficult to do. But the spreading out the models in general, it doesn't always necessarily have to be in the T formation. That's the easiest way to achieve it. And if you've got kind of a wide open lane, then you are kind of able to do that. But if you're in close quarters, then it could be a little bit more difficult. So the other way I've done it is creating a bubble around the unit and then pulling those models as they die. And then the rest of the units in those bubbles die to coherency, and same idea. But there are times where it can be difficult to pull off, and that was one of the harder things to work around. The easiest way I found around that was, if I wasn't going to be able to activate these units, if there was no real feasible way to create those kind of scenarios where I couldn't pull out of coherency, I would deep strike my units nearby primary objectives, so that at the very least, if they were tied up going into my turn, they could regrow a bunch of guys onto the objective, score me primary. And if they were stuck somewhere, then at the very least, they could be stuck scoring me primary through the course of the game.
Yeah, I like that. And it's all about kind of like putting the OC of your big units of dudes on objectives. I think that's going to be a critical component to this army's success on the table, right? Like you said, if a rhino touches you, you're stuck there for the rest of the game. So you need to make sure you're stuck on a point that actually helps.
Exactly. I think the best thing you can do for your opponent is deep strike your big damaging unit in some random backline where there's no primary objectives, because then a good player will just turn around, ignore that unit for the rest of the game, because it moves 6 inches and that's all it does for the rest of the game. So you have to create situations where you can put your big damaging units in places where they want to be for the rest of the game, because the army has very little mobility once you're on the board, is one of the big problems with it. So you have to use the mobility of deep striking to the fullest before you get on the board and you're kind of stuck where you are.
Okay. So tell me about that loss condition you had identified with your opponent going first and blitzing your army before you get a chance to deep strike on all your stuff. I know I play GSC. It's what I'm most afraid of. When I play against GSC, it's what I try to do. How do you handle that?
The easiest, I spent about, I would say, 300-ish points on just screens, so that I had the ability to help myself from that. The 5-man Atlan Jackal unit creates a pretty huge footprint. So those guys, and they scout 9, which is a lot further than most people are ready to deal with screens. And then the 5-man Genestealers on 32mm bases, in combination with the Jackals, were typically able to create a long enough line that my opponent couldn't get as close to me as they wanted. And in the matchups where I was really, really worried about getting ran down, I would start 1, and if it was a super fast army, 2 Benefictus units on the board, because they have lethal hits all the time, so they can kind of keep their damage starting on the board. They don't need to deep strike in to do as much damage as they need to. And then that would be a response to if somebody just threw their entire army in front of me, I could shoot 40 neophytes with 2 Benefictuses at them.
Right. And then once your damage starts like just connecting, that's not the hard part, right? When you shoot something, it typically just dies.
Yep. And then the 20-man neophyte with the Iconward was also a huge help because in matchups where they were melee heavy and they wanted to run up and just tag my units, if they had something like spawn, because spawn are another really big problem because a lot of the spawn in armies can scout. The world eater spawn, scout, move 10, advance and charge. So that's probably one of the scariest units as a GSC player to see on the board because that unit moves ridiculously fast. It doesn't really die to Reductuses because it's got that 5-up Feel No Pain. So into matchups like that, the 20-man with the Feel No Pain will effectively wrap another 20-man with a Benefictus so that they're getting tagged, and then they can fall back onto a primary or something the next turn. And the Benefictus unit that they were wrapping can shoot the unit that came in charged.
Yeah. That's so technical. I love it. Okay, a few more questions about your actual list choices here. I see all these little 5-man acolytes with hand flamers. They're one of my favorite units in GSC. What is the idea with these guys?
Those guys they're the Bob the Builders of the list, and they can fix any problem that I really need them to go to. I drew a established locus, and I got to get something into their backfield that I don't want to be a big 20-man neophyte unit. I'll send those guys to do it. I need to send something out on an objective to clear off some scouts. Those guys are the guys for the job. They are some of my favorite and most well-rounded units in the list. The other thing that they're really helpful for is often the +1 to wound stratagem requires 2 units to shoot at the same unit and makes them ineligible to shoot at any other units. So you don't want to always be shooting 40 neophytes into the same target, which means you have to find a second target for that +1 to wound stratagem. And just giving +1 to wound to a bunch of hand flamers that have full rules to wound on objectives and get +1 AP and ignores cover is very, very helpful, because oftentimes what would happen is the big neophyte unit would drop in, they'd shoot at a knight, the knight would be alive on 3 or 4 wounds, but would be on an objective, and then the Flamer Acolytes could just clear off the rest of the wounds because they're +1 to wound with full rerolls to wound. And
I
they
love
were,
that. Yeah. They just kind of problem solve everything with Deep Strike. They're OC2. They can do an action. They trigger your rules for you with the +1 to wound. I never even thought of that tactic. That's really clever. So, because you're right, you don't want to shoot 40 neophytes at one target, which is what you have to do to trigger that ability. They're great. And I've noticed you've gone for the icon and all these little 5-mans instead of the extra flamer. That's a small little detail choice that I don't see a lot of people doing. What's your thought with that?
So my big thought with that was with the new reworked Cult Ambush, now that you don't roll for it, and you have the certainty of bringing units back, I've found a lot of people will just leave units alive because they know that I could just get them back for sure instead of rolling for it. Because a lot of people previously would just kill as many units as possible, and then especially starting turn 3 when the roll got worse. When that was the way that it worked. It's gone through a few iterations at this point, this edition.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing a lot of people try to do against GSC is leave units alive on a few models. And so when that guy can bring back 2 or 3 guys that are on an objective and then they're 8 OC there all of a sudden, I found that to be a lot more useful than the extra flamer most of the times.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, now I got to ask about this gaggle of characters you have. 3 Reductuses, a Primus, a Kelermorph, 2 Benefictus, and Iconward. That's so many. Tell me about these Reductus. I know you said they do so many mortal wounds. I have never in my life gotten my Reductuses to work that well. They just like die and don't do that many mortal wounds. What is going on with these things?
Those guys they're just, every time, they're like the early game of the Flamer Acolytes. They can start wherever I really need them to. They're lone op. They can stand on my expansion objective and never worry about getting hit by anything. If you're playing against something like Tyranids, which I thought would be a little bit more represented, they weren't actually at this event. They're Reductuses are my favorite counter in the world to lictors because they walk up, they set the mortals off, and then when they go to charge, you can set more mortal wounds off on them. And then the other big one was the Reductus's indirect profile, which is something that I didn't really think about almost ever because it was just kind of one of those weird little, I guess she also gets that on top of the billion good rules that she has.
Right.
But with Thousand Suns being here, and they have the Zangor Enlightened on discs, Reductuses really like to shoot at those because they're strength 5. They really like to shoot at Poxwalkers, which are fairly prevalent with Death Guard running around. A lot of Knights players were taking like a 5-man Inquisitorial Agent squad to hold their backfield. So if you could deploy that Reductus a little aggressively with their 24-inch range, then that plus the Ridge Runners in the early turn could often give you a kill on a unit holding the backfield objective. And then Host's command point economy is not the greatest in the world, but Grenade is one of by far the best stratagems in the game, in my opinion. Just throwing 3 mortal wounds onto something there's not much more useful than that. So having the ability to threaten that at 3 points in the board was very helpful with the Reductuses because I was pretty much getting a free grenade into any target I want almost every turn of the game where it mattered.
Wow. Yeah. And did you not find your opponent was able to like maybe sneak up on them and kill them without they triggering the bomb roll or get in range of all 3 of them at the same time to kind of make having excess of ones redundant?
So yes, I did have my game into Jack at his Eldar. I did lose 3 of the 4 lone ops on turn 1, and that was one of the scarier parts for them. But I usually will play a couple of them a little bit more conservatively, just because with the indirect and they're good at standing. I usually have one on my expansion, and if I'm playing into a matchup where there's indirect, I'll have one on my home field objective ready to kind of run forward. So in the matchups where your opponent can threaten the mobility to hit all 3 of them in a single turn, you just have to kind of play the game with that in mind and force them to make bad decisions to take care of all 3 Reductuses. And with the Reductus mine going down from the original 12-inch range to 9-inch, because I guess I could agree to some people's opinions that might have been a little bit broken.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. A lone op that you have to take a billion mortals before you want to interact with might be a little too far. So they would often play a lot more behind walls. This tournament was all layout 1 and 6. Mm-hmm. So 1 and 6 actually have quite a few very good staging points for Reductuses in my experience. On layout 6 Search and Destroy, which was 2 of the missions for the event, you could put the Reductus behind the terrain piece on your opponent's expansion objective, and that one was very difficult to interact with, and then 1 on your expansion and 1 on the center objective. So being able to kind of put those units where I needed, also into Knights. The Knights matchup was what they were mostly there for, because the Knight players can kill them very, very easily, but setting off those mortals is very helpful in consistently taking out Knights, because a 20-man Neophyte squad won't always do the job, but stacking the mortals on top of that would often push it just over the edge to where the Knights would die.
Absolutely. I love it. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially into Knights. I think they're a great call for the meta. Knights, Death Guard, these types of armies have to walk a tank into 9 inches of this guy, and nope, that's half your tank gone in case of a Death Guard little vehicle or a good chunk of a Knight handled. So just a couple more questions before we head on to part 2 and actually break down all these games, including that game where you lost 4 lone ops against Jack Harvester on turn 1 and still won somehow. If you are listening to this, it probably means you play Warhammer 40k. And if you're playing Warhammer, you know you need a lot of dice. Baron of Dice is where we get our dice from. They produce amazing different kinds of dice. We just recently got all kinds of different faction dice shipped to us, which we use on our stream games. But not only do they look really cool, but they're highly customizable. You can get different symbols, corners that are square, corners that are round, different shapes and sizes, different sided dice. It's all the rage. And they're customizable in color and design as well. They are so cool looking. Not only that, but they feel great to roll in your hands. I've never held dice that roll and feel this good. Not only that, but they are scientifically perfectly balanced. There are tons of case studies on people rolling thousands of dice and recording all the results that they get. And sometimes you might get a die that rolls just a few too many ones. We've all had to throw it out before. These dice are not like that. They are perfectly balanced to a T, thousands of rolls, perfect distribution. If you want to take your Warhammer game seriously and make sure the dice are not screwing you over, get some Baron of dice. How do you handle secondaries with this army? I imagine things come fairly easy to you with all these units in deep striking, or is there more nuance to it than that?
I get very excited when I see an action secondary, which is often the opposite reaction for a lot of my opponents. When they get the action secondaries, they're not as happy about it. But when I see a sabotage, a cleanse, a locust, something like that, I'm usually pretty excited because that's almost a guaranteed however many number of points the card is. Anything where I have to position my units, like engage, Display of Might was a new one that got added, and when I saw that secondary card for the first time, I was a little over the moon with that one.
Yeah, have more units in no man's land. Okay, I think you can manage.
I think I could put a few guys there. So, but sometimes something like an Assassinate would come a little bit difficult.
Yeah, right. If you get a kill secondary on a turn where you're not able to send all the damage.
Exactly. The new reworked Marked was actually probably one of my favorite kill secondaries to draw, especially if it was on a turn where I hadn't deep strike most of my army, because you can't just kind of mark a rhino that's sitting behind a wall, because that is definitely something that Genestealer cults can get to. Mm-hmm. But the kill secondaries were the most difficult ones to achieve, I would say. So usually I'd try and cycle through those if I had the ability to. If I had the economy to get rid of those. If the Acolytes on my home field got me an extra command point for the turn, I'd try and get rid of them. Fish for those action ones. But action ones are a fairly large majority of the deck in Tournament Companion 2025, whatever they're not
chapter approved, Tucker. Come on.
Pariah Nexus is what we've been calling it.
Oh, that's the Nexus. Oh, I like that. I like that.
So...
Now, what about Primary? You've got a million OC bodies, but it's so fascinating to me because if your opponent is just on the objectives, you by nature have to deep strike off of the objectives. So it can be actually a long time until you get your millions of OC onto the objectives. Is that ever an issue for you?
It has been previously, and that was one of the reasons why the 20-man with the Iconward got added to the list, because that's a unit that's really good at starting on the board, advancing turn one to stage behind a ruin, and then just kind of being able to jump out onto a primary with a normal move rather than with a deep strike. If I go first, typically the game plan is to move block as hard as I can with like one squad of Pure Strains and the Atlan Jackal squad, and then put Lone Ops on the objective to kind of try and do away with the primary advantage my opponent has for going second. And then typically, if I was going second, GSC with Cult Ambush just kind of has the staying power to get to that end of game 15 points that they usually need. And then you kind of play towards the later half of the game with them.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Now, what about your opponent's side of the game? Are they able to pick Assassinate against you with all these characters and maybe call the Horde and just max that score out?
So the Assassinate Call the Horfix was definitely something that I had to look into to see how difficult it would be. If my opponent would pick Call the Horde, then I would usually play a little bit more conservatively, because a lot of the Call targets are also where the characters are hanging out. So it's kind of like picking Assassinate, Bring It Down into Knights, where it's a little bit more of an all or nothing. So if I could just play conservatively and win on primary with my big 20-man units, then often they can't get to the characters and whatnot quick enough to score enough secondaries to win the game. Mm-hmm. And then I can score all of the tacticals that I'm drawing with little 5-man Flamer Acolytes and stuff like that.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, Tucker, I got one more question before we head over to part 2 to really get into the nitty-gritty good stuff. If you had a piece of advice you can give any Warhammer player looking to get better at the game or just get better enjoyment out of their hobby, since you do that so well, what would that be?
I would say play out all of your games. I think that's something that's become a little bit more popular, especially with team events, but there are a lot of people that still only play in singles. I think there's a lot of value in playing at a game that you kind of know you're going to lose or you think you're going to lose, because that's where you can get the experience to know what to do in the situations where a game might be closer. So just play out all your games.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the wonderful advice. I couldn't agree more that playing out your games actually really does make a huge difference in figuring out who is the better Warhammer player in the long run, helping you get better. And it's been an absolutely pleasure talking to you, Tucker. I feel like I've learned a lot as a Genestealer Cult player from your faction expertise here, and I'm excited to bring it to the table next time I play the faction. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and listeners, thank you so much for listening. I hope you all enjoyed it. Tucker, you ready for part 2?
I'm ready.
Let's do it. Listeners, we'll see you over there, patreon.com/AOW40K. Don't miss it.
Like what you just listened to? Check out Art of War Down Under and Art of War Unbroken on the competitive 40K network. The Art of War 40K.com.